My name is Lila Hernandez. I'm 34. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and the man I married took everything from me in a single afternoon. He took my children. He took my career. And then he had the nerve to tell everyone I was crazy. I want you to sit with that for a second. The woman he called unstable, the woman he filmed during her worst moment and handed that footage to a judge, that same woman ended up sitting in a courtroom 3 years later, not as a defendant, not as a broken ex-wife, but as a licensed expert witness. And she destroyed him. I destroyed him, with facts, with science, with the very skills he spent years trying to convince me I didn't have. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story only makes sense if you understand how carefully Evan Hernandez built his trap, and how long I walked around inside it without even knowing the walls were closing in. I met Evan when I was 24. I was finishing my master's program in clinical psychology at Arizona State. He was charming in that quiet, steady way that feels safe when you're young and tired of loud people. He listened. He remembered small things. He showed up on time. Back then, those felt like green flags. I didn't know yet that some men learn exactly what to offer a woman so that she feels seen, not because they see her, but because they want her to stay. Evan was patient. He waited until I was invested before he started changing things. That's what I've learned about coercive control since then. It doesn't start with yelling. It starts with small adjustments. A comment here, a suggestion there, a slow, quiet erosion that you don't notice because each individual moment seems so minor. We got married when I was 26. By then I had my license and I was building a practice. Nothing huge. A small client base, a shared office space, referrals from a few local doctors. I was proud of it. Honestly, I was really proud. I had worked so hard to get there. I came from a family where mental health wasn't talked about, where you pushed through things, where going to therapy meant something was wrong with you. And here I was, not just understanding that world, but helping people navigate it. That felt meaningful. It still does. But Evan had a different relationship with my career than I realized. He smiled about it in public. At dinner parties, he'd say, "My wife's a psychologist," and let people be impressed. But in private, it was different. In private, my career was something that made me too busy, too distracted, too unavailable. It was always slightly in the way. Maya was born when I was 27. And I will tell you honestly, becoming a mother changed something fundamental in me. I loved that little girl in a way that reorganized my whole chest. She had these big dark eyes and she was so alert from the very first day. She looked at the world like she was already trying to figure it out. My son was born 2 years later, and I thought, okay, this is it. This is the life, hard and full and real. I thought Evan and I were building something. I genuinely thought that. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not a woman who ignored obvious signs. I was a trained psychologist who missed what was happening in her own home. That's not a failure of intelligence. That's how good Evan was at what he did. And that's how blind love makes you, even when you should know better. The isolation started slowly. Evan had reasons for everything. My friend Daniela, she was too negative. My colleague from grad school, he seemed like he had feelings for me. My mentor, Dr. Renee Collins, she put too many ideas in my head. One by one, my connections got complicated. Spending time with people became a negotiation. It became an explanation. Eventually, it became easier to just stay home. I told myself I was choosing family. I told myself I was prioritizing what mattered. But really, I was slowly becoming someone who only existed in relation to Evan. And Evan liked me that way. He did. I can see it so clearly now. He liked me smaller. He liked me uncertain. He liked me checking his face for approval before I said things out loud. And here's the part that's hardest to explain. When you're a psychologist and this is happening to you, there's this awful second layer of shame, because I knew the terminology. I had sat across from clients and explained exactly these patterns, and still I could not apply that knowledge to my own life, because your brain doesn't let you. When you love someone, when you've built a life with someone, when your children call that person daddy, your brain will work overtime to find alternative explanations. I wasn't being isolated. I was being protected. I wasn't being controlled. I was being cared for. I wasn't losing my mind. I was just tired. I was just stressed. I was just having a hard time. That's what I told myself for years. And Evan helped me tell myself that. Every time I started to feel something was wrong, he was right there to offer an explanation that made it my fault. My anxiety, my sensitivity, my instability. He used those words so often that eventually I started using them too. I want you to keep watching because what comes next is the part that still makes my hands shake a little when I think about it. Not from fear anymore, from anger. Good anger, necessary anger. About 3 years into our marriage, I started having panic attacks. Real ones. The kind where your chest seizes and you can't catch your breath, and your brain convinces you something is catastrophically wrong. I want to be clear about something here. Having panic attacks does not make someone mentally unfit. It does not make someone a bad mother. Millions of people have anxiety disorders and live full, functional, loving lives. But Evan knew that in our world, in the clinical world I occupied, that word, unstable, carried weight. He had been listening to me talk about mental health for years. He understood exactly which words would land hardest. He understood exactly how to frame a narrative. One evening I had a bad episode. Maya was at a sleepover, my son was asleep. I was alone in the kitchen and something small triggered a full spiral. I was on the floor, I was breathing hard. I was talking to myself the way you do when you're trying to get through it. I didn't know Evan was home. I didn't know he had come back early. And I didn't know he was filming me from the doorway. He never told me. He just watched. He just recorded. And then he saved that video and waited. 2 months later, I came home from work to find Evan standing in the living room with my children behind him and a piece of paper on the table. An emergency custody order. He had gone to the court without me. He had filed for emergency custody on the grounds that I was mentally unstable and posed a risk to our children. He had submitted that video as evidence. He had also submitted what he called therapist notes, documents that I had never seen, supposedly from a therapist I had apparently been seeing, apparently saying things about my mental state that were fabricated. I stood there in my own living room and I felt the floor disappear. My son was 4 years old and he was looking at me like he didn't understand what was happening. Maya was 7 and she was looking at her father. And Evan looked calm. That's the part that still gets me. He looked completely calm. I was allowed to take some of my clothes. I was told I would have supervised visitation. Supervised. As though my children needed protection from me. As though I was a danger to the 2 people I loved most in the world. I drove to a parking lot and I sat there for 2 hours and I did not know who I was anymore. Here's what happened next. Within 2 weeks of the custody order, Evan had contacted my licensing board. He filed a complaint. He claimed I had been practicing while mentally impaired. The board was required to investigate. They placed me under supervision. It meant I could not see clients independently. It meant referrals dried up immediately. People talk. In a small professional community, people talk very fast. I went from a functioning psychologist with a growing practice to someone under professional review in about 3 weeks. I had almost no income. I had legal fees piling up. I had supervised visitation twice a week for 2 hours at a time at a state facility where a woman with a clipboard watched me hug my daughter. I won't sugarcoat the next part. I fell apart. Of course I did. I was human. I was a mother who couldn't tuck her children in at night. I was a professional who had been publicly labeled unstable. I was a woman who had lost the life she thought she had, all at once, all through the deliberate actions of someone she had trusted completely. There were weeks I didn't leave my apartment. There were nights I couldn't eat. There were moments where I genuinely questioned whether Evan had been right, whether something really was wrong with me, whether I really was too broken to deserve my own children. That's what sustained abuse does. It makes you doubt yourself so deeply that even after the person is gone, their voice stays inside your head doing the work for them. But I had Dr. Renee Collins, my mentor, the woman Evan had spent years trying to wedge me away from. I called her from my apartment floor at 11 at night, about 6 weeks after losing the kids. I don't know what I expected. Sympathy, maybe, practical advice. What she said instead was this: "Lila, you know exactly what's being done to you, so now you have to decide what you're going to do about it." That was it. That was the whole speech. And I stayed up until 4 a.m. writing down everything I remembered. Every incident, every comment, every isolation tactic, every moment where Evan had undermined my confidence, reframed my perceptions, controlled the narrative. I wrote it all down in clinical language because that was the only language I had left that still felt like mine. If you're still here, I want you to know this story is not just about me. This happens to women everywhere, and I think you need to hear the rest of it. Dr. Renee connected me with a family law attorney who had worked on coercive control cases. Her name was Patricia, and she was meticulous. She pulled the court filings. She looked at the supposed therapist notes Evan had submitted. Within 2 weeks, she had identified inconsistencies. The dates were off. The formatting didn't match standard clinical documentation. The therapist named in the notes, she contacted her. That woman had never treated me, had never met me, had no record of me whatsoever. The notes were fabricated, completely fabricated. This took time to build into something we could use legally, but it was a thread. And I held onto that thread like it was the only thing keeping me vertical, because it was. Meanwhile, I rebuilt, slowly, painfully, one day at a time. I continued under supervision, not because I was required to at that point, but because I chose to work with Dr. Renee in a structured way that would eventually give the licensing board nothing to point at. I started specializing. I had always worked in general mental health, but now I focused specifically on coercive control and domestic abuse. I took certifications. I read every piece of current research I could find. I consulted on cases. I became, through the very worst experience of my life, genuinely expert in the exact pattern that had been used against me. I don't know what you call that. Maybe survival, maybe necessity, maybe both. My visitation hours slowly expanded. Maya would sit next to me in the visitation center and color and tell me about school, and I would hold every single word like it was a gift. My son would climb on me, and I would breathe him in and smile and hold back every feeling that wanted to come out because I was not going to fall apart in front of my children. They needed me steady, so I was steady. For 2 hours twice a week, I was the calmest, most present version of myself I could manage. And then I would get into my car and drive 2 blocks away and cry until I couldn't anymore. The financial strain was relentless. Legal fees in custody cases are brutal, especially when one party is deliberately making things complicated. Evan contested everything. He delayed everything. Every motion, every hearing, every small procedural step cost me money I was scraping together from a reduced practice and a payment plan with my attorney. I moved into a smaller apartment. I stopped buying things I didn't absolutely need. I took on extra consultation work on weekends. I documented everything, every cent, every interaction, every supervised visit. I built a record the way I would build a case file because that's what it was. It was a case file for my own life. 18 months after losing custody, my attorney filed a motion to revisit the original emergency order. We had the discrepancies in the fabricated notes. We had a declaration from the therapist who had never treated me. We had a pattern of professional sabotage. And we had a family court evaluator brought in by the judge, the Honorable Judge Carla Benton, who interviewed both Evan and me over several sessions. Judge Benton was thorough. I respected that even when I was terrified of what it meant, the evaluator's report was not a slam dunk in my favor. It was cautious. It recommended a gradual increase in my parenting time pending continued stability. It was not what I wanted, but it was movement. For the first time in 18 months, something moved. And I want you to hear this next part very carefully, because this is where the story changes. About 2 years after everything started, I got a call from a legal team in Tucson. They were working on a family court case involving a pattern of coercive control, a woman who had lost custody under similar circumstances, a husband who had used her mental health history against her, documentation that had been questioned. They needed an expert witness, someone who could testify about coercive control tactics, about how they manifest, about how they are specifically weaponized in custody proceedings. They had been referred to me by Dr. Renee. I almost said no. I was still in the middle of my own case. I was still exhausted. But Dr. Renee pushed me. She said this was exactly what my expertise was built for, so I said yes. I reviewed the case files. I prepared my testimony. I was ready. And then, about a week before the hearing, I received the formal documentation package from the legal team, the full disclosure of parties involved. I opened the file. I read the name of the defendant. I read it twice. I put the papers down. I picked them up again. Evan Hernandez, my Evan. The man who had taken my children, fabricated documents, and called me crazy was the defendant in a coercive control case brought by another woman. A woman named Serena who had dated him after our separation, who had a child with him, who had experienced the exact same pattern. The isolation, the recorded episodes, the professional sabotage, the custody manipulation. Evan had done it again, or more accurately, Evan had never stopped. He just found a new person to do it to. I had to make a decision. I called my attorney. I called Dr. Renee. I sat with it for 2 days. There was a version of this where I stepped aside, where I recused myself because of my personal connection to the defendant, because it would be cleaner, because it would protect me from accusations of bias. And then there was another version. The version where I was the most qualified person in Arizona to explain precisely what Evan Hernandez had done to that woman. Where everything I had lived through had made me an expert that no one else in that room could be. My attorney said the disclosure was enough. The legal team and the judge would be made aware of my relationship to the defendant. It would be on the record. And then it would be my job to be so clinically precise, so professionally grounded, so completely unimpeachable in my testimony that the personal history would only underscore the pattern. I chose to testify. I want to take a breath here, because I need you to understand what it means to walk into a courtroom and sit in the witness stand and look across the room and see the face of the person who dismantled your life, and then to speak calmly, to use your training, to lay out a pattern of behavior in clinical language with citations and research and case precedent, to not cry, to not shake, to not let him see that any part of you is still that woman on the kitchen floor. I had been preparing for that moment for 3 years without knowing it. Every certification, every consultation, every case I worked on. Every night I lay awake going over my own history and trying to make sense of it. It all converged in that room. I testified for 4 hours. I explained coercive control. I explained how it is deployed specifically in custody proceedings. I explained the documented tactics, isolation, reputation destruction, manufactured evidence of mental instability, financial control through litigation. I referenced studies. I cited outcomes. And then, when the opposing counsel asked me about my personal connection to the defendant, I answered directly. I said yes, Evan Hernandez had been my husband. I said yes, these exact tactics had been used against me. I said I had lost custody of my own children through fabricated documentation that a court had since identified as fraudulent. I said all of it in the same tone I had used for everything else. Even, clear, professional. Evan's attorney tried to discredit me. They argued bias. They argued that my personal history made me unreliable. Judge Carla Benton, who, in a coincidence that felt like something more than coincidence, was the same judge handling both cases, listened to that argument, and then said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said that personal experience of a pattern, combined with professional expertise in that pattern, did not constitute bias. It constituted comprehension, and then she allowed my full testimony to stand. The outcome of Serena's case went in her favor. The custody arrangement was modified. The coercive control pattern was formally entered into the record. And because both cases were in front of Judge Benton, and because the pattern was now documented across 2 separate complaints against the same defendant, my own custody case was reopened for full review. I want to be honest with you about the ending, because I said this was bittersweet, and I meant that. The full custody review took another 8 months. There were more hearings, more evaluations, more legal fees that took me another year to dig out from under. I got Maya back on a primary basis 14 months after the Tucson testimony. My son came home 6 weeks after that. The night Maya walked through my door with her backpack and her big dark eyes, the same eyes she'd had as a baby, looking at the world like she was already trying to figure it out, I held her and I didn't cry. I had nothing left for crying. I just held her and breathed and thought, okay, we're here now. But I will not pretend that 3 years didn't happen. I will not pretend that my children didn't grow during that time without me there at night, that my son doesn't have a gap in his memory of me that I can't fully fill in, that Maya doesn't sometimes go quiet in a way that tells me she's processing things that a child shouldn't have had to process. The time is gone. You don't get it back. Evan took it. The system, imperfect, slow, sometimes blind, allowed him to take it. And even when the system corrected itself, it couldn't undo what had already been lost. That's the bittersweet part. The truth is that justice, when it comes, is rarely complete. It's just better than the alternative. My practice is fully reinstated now. The licensing board closed its investigation with no findings against me. I specialize in coercive control cases. I consult with attorneys, with family court systems, with professionals who are trying to understand how abuse operates in legal and clinical spaces. I speak at conferences. I train other clinicians. I have turned the worst thing that ever happened to me into the most purposeful work I have ever done. Dr. Renee jokes that I have become more expert than she is. She says it with pride, and I receive it with the kind of gratitude that doesn't have adequate words. Evan lost his case. He has limited supervised visitation with his child by Serena. I don't know what his life looks like now, and I have made a deliberate clinical decision to stop spending mental energy on that question. What he did lives in court records now. It's documented. It has a name. And the names of what he did, coercive control, financial abuse, psychological manipulation, fabrication of evidence, those names matter. Because numbing something is the first step towards stopping it from happening to someone else. I want to leave you with this. If you are watching this and you feel like you're losing your mind inside your own home, you might not be losing your mind. Someone might be helping you feel that way. The doubt you feel about your own perception might not be yours. It might be borrowed from someone who needs you to doubt yourself in order to stay in control. Please hear me on that. I spent years not hearing it, even with all my training, even with everything I knew. So I'm not saying it to judge anyone. I'm saying it because I wish someone had said it clearly to me. I'm Lila Hernandez. I was called crazy by a man who was afraid of what I was capable of. And 3 years later, I sat in his courtroom and showed exactly what I was capable of. Not out of revenge, out of truth. There's a difference. Revenge would have felt good for a moment. Truth rebuilt my life. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about this for real. If someone you loved was slowly convincing you that your own mind couldn't be trusted, would you recognize it? Would you have the language for it? Or would you do what I did? Would you stay quiet and call it love? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if it made you think of someone you know, if any part of it felt true to you, please share it. Not for the numbers, for the person who needs to hear it. That person exists. They're in someone's life right now, on that kitchen floor, not knowing there's a way through. Be the reason they find this. Like this video, subscribe to the family I knew, and come back for the next story. Because every week we sit together in the hard, real, human truth of what families actually look like behind closed doors. And every week, we find our way through it together. I'll see you there.